The guard mocked the retired black teacher in the diaper aisle, not knowing the cashier carried his last name. The alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., but Charles Wilson was already awake. He'd been staring at the ceiling for the past hour, listening to Sarah's breathing beside him. The soft whistle of her exhales had become his morning companion over the past 8 months, ever since the stroke. "Good morning, my love," he whispered, reaching over to touch her hand. Her fingers twitched slightly, the most movement she could manage on her right side now. The bedroom was still dark, but Charles moved with practiced precision. He'd learned to navigate this new routine without thinking. First, the lights. Then, Sarah's morning medications. The pills rattled in their orange bottles as he lined them up on the bedside table. "Time for your medicine, Sarah." Charles gently raised the head of the hospital bed they'd installed in their bedroom. "Let's get you sitting up." Sarah's eyes followed him, alert despite her paralysis. They still held that same sparkle he'd fallen in love with 50 years ago, even if her face couldn't show it anymore. As he helped her with the pills, his hand brushed against the adult diaper. It felt damp. They were running low on supplies again. Charles checked the package in the bathroom cabinet. Only 2 left. "We need to make a store run today," he said, returning to the bedroom. "Running low on your supplies?" Sarah blinked twice, their signal for yes. The memory hit him suddenly. Their anniversary dinner 8 months ago. The way she dropped her fork mid-sentence. The confusion in her eyes. The terrifying slump of her body to one side. The waiter calling 911. The endless night in the emergency room. Charles shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. He had a task to focus on. Opening his banking app, he winced at the balance. Their retirement savings weren't meant to cover medical expenses like these. Teaching for 40 years had given them comfort, not luxury. A knock at the door interrupted his calculations. "Mr. Wilson?" "Mrs. Martinez from next door called through the screen. "Everything okay? I saw your light on early again." "We're fine, Clara," Charles answered, opening the door. "Just getting an early start." Mrs. Martinez peered past him, concern evident on her face. "If you need any help, we're managing just fine," Charles said firmly. He appreciated the neighbor's concern, but pride kept him from accepting help. "Thank you, though." Back in the bedroom, he finished helping Sarah with her morning routine. Her nightgown was replaced with a fresh one, her silver hair carefully brushed. As he worked, he hummed their song, the one they danced to at their wedding. "I'll be back soon," he promised, leaning down to kiss her forehead. Sarah's hand moved slightly, catching his fingers in a weak grip. Her eyes said what her voice couldn't anymore. "Be careful." Charles patted his chest pocket, checking for his wallet. The navy blazer hung on the back of the door, the small pin from the Teachers Association still attached to the lapel. 40 years of teaching history at Lincoln High School, and this pin was what he had to show for it. That and the respect of generations of students. He slipped the blazer on, straightening it in the mirror. The familiar weight of the fabric settled on his shoulders like armor. In the reflection, he saw a dignified man of 72, his white hair neatly trimmed, his posture still military straight from his years in service. "I'll get your supplies, Sarah," he said, touching the pin for luck. "Won't be gone long." He checked her one last time. Water within reach, emergency buttons secured to her wrist, morning shows playing quietly on the TV. Everything in order. As Charles backed the old Buick out of the driveway, the sun was just beginning to rise. The familiar drive to the supermarket stretched ahead of him, a journey he'd made countless times before. But lately, something had changed. The store didn't feel as welcoming anymore, not since they'd hired that new security guard. Charles gripped the steering wheel tighter, his wedding ring catching the early morning light. He'd faced prejudice before. 40 years of teaching in a predominantly white school had taught him every shade of discrimination. But that was before Sarah got sick, before every trip to the store became a necessity rather than a choice. The supermarket's parking lot was starting to fill with early morning shoppers. Charles parked in his usual spot, close to the entrance. He sat for a moment, straightening his blazer one more time, touching the teacher's pin for reassurance. Just another supply run, he muttered to himself, reaching for the door handle. In and out, but as he walked toward the store entrance, he saw him. The new security guard, already watching from his post by the sliding doors. Mike Brennan, according to his name tag, though Charles had never been close enough to read it properly. The guard's eyes tracked him as he approached, and Charles felt his shoulders tense involuntarily. He squared them again, lifted his chin slightly. He had nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to hide. He was just a husband buying supplies for his wife. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, welcoming him into the fluorescent-lit interior. Charles took a deep breath, reminding himself of why he was here. Sarah was waiting at home. She needed these supplies. That was all that mattered. Morning, he nodded politely to the guard as he passed. Mike Brennan didn't respond, just shifted his position slightly to keep Charles in his line of sight. The diaper aisle was at the back of the store. Charles knew exactly where to go. Third aisle from the right, halfway down. He'd made this journey so many times he could do it blindfolded. But today, like every day recently, he felt the weight of eyes on his back as he walked. It was going to be one of those days. He could feel it in his bones. The morning rush was picking up as Charles navigated through the aisles. Shopping carts squeaked against linoleum floors, and early shoppers shuffled around with their coffee cups. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything look slightly unreal. He heard Mike Brennan's footsteps before he saw him. The guard wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. His heavy boots echoed against the floor, always a few yards behind Charles. The sound followed him past the cereal aisle, past the canned goods, past the paper products. "Can I help you find something?" Mike's voice carried across the aisle, loud enough for other customers to hear. Charles kept his eyes forward. "No, thank you. I know exactly what I need. You've been wandering these aisles for a while now." The guard's tone held an edge of accusation. "I've been here less than 5 minutes," Charles replied calmly, though he felt his heart rate picking up. He'd taught long enough to recognize intimidation tactics when he saw them. A young employee stocking shelves nearby looked up, concern crossing her face. Her name tag read Jenny. She couldn't have been more than 20, probably one of his former students' children. "Mr. Wilson comes in every Thursday," Jenny said, addressing Mike. "He's a regular." Mike ignored her, keeping his eyes fixed on Charles. "Store policy requires me to monitor suspicious behavior." The word suspicious hung in the air like smoke. Charles felt his teacher's pin pressing against his chest through his blazer. It reminded him of his last day at Lincoln High, standing before his final class. "You know what I see when I look at you?" He'd told his students that day. "I see the future. And the future doesn't care what color you are, where you came from, or what others think of you. The future only cares about what you do with your chances." Now, in this fluorescent-lit aisle, those words felt like they belonged to another lifetime. "Sir," Mike stepped closer, "I'm going to need you to show me what's in your pockets." A few shoppers slowed their carts, watching the scene unfold. Charles saw phones being pulled out, their camera lenses glinting under the harsh lighting. "I'm here to buy supplies for my wife," Charles said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Just like I am every Thursday morning." "Then you won't mind proving that." Jenny, the shelf stocker, stood up straighter. "Mike, I told you he's a regular customer." "Stay out of this," Jenny might cut her off. "Store security is my responsibility." Charles felt sweat beading on his forehead. The air conditioning seemed to blow colder, and the aisle felt longer than usual. He needed to get to the diaper section, get what he came for, and get home to Sarah. She would be wondering where he was. More footsteps approached. 2 more security guards, presumably called by Mike through his radio. They positioned themselves at either end of the aisle, cutting off easy escape routes. A memory flashed through Charles's mind. His first day teaching at Lincoln High in 1983. The way the principal had watched him, the way some parents had pulled their children from his class, the whispers in the hallways. But he'd stayed. He'd proven himself. He'd earned their respect. "Mr. Wilson." Jenny's voice was soft. "Do you need help finding anything?" Before Charles could answer, Mike stepped between them. "Ma'am, please return to your duties. This is a security matter now." Charles looked at his watch. 8:15 a.m. Sarah would need her next round of medication by 9 o'clock. He didn't have time for this confrontation. "Young man," he addressed Mike directly, drawing himself up to his full height. "I've been shopping at this store since before you were born. If you have specific concerns, state them clearly. Otherwise, I have errands to complete. The guard's face reddened. Empty your pockets. Now. More phones appeared. More customers gathered. Charles could hear whispers, could feel the weight of stares. Some sympathetic, some suspicious, all of them watching to see what would happen next. He thought about Sarah, waiting at home, about the empty supply cabinet, about the dignity he'd taught his students to maintain, even in the face of ignorance. I will not empty my pockets, Charles said firmly. I am a customer in this store, and I will be treated as one. Mike's hand moved to his radio. Then we're going to have a problem. The only problem, Charles replied, is that you're preventing me from completing my shopping. He took a step forward, intending to continue to the diaper aisle. Mike moved to block his path. Sir, if you don't comply, I'll have to call the police. The threat hung in the air like a physical thing. Charles felt his legs wanting to shake, but he kept them steady. Decades of standing before classrooms had taught him how to hide weakness. Jenny had disappeared down the aisle, hopefully to find a manager. The other guards maintained their positions, watching silently. Phones continued recording. Charles thought about his options. He could leave, go to another store, avoid the confrontation. But Sarah needed these supplies, and this was his store, had been for 40 years. He'd faced down harder challenges than an overzealous security guard. Young man, Charles said, his teacher's voice emerging naturally. I suggest you think very carefully about your next action. Mike's radio crackled. Brennan, report to front desk. The guard hesitated, his hand still on his radio. The moment stretched, taut as a wire. Charles used the pause to take another step forward. This time, Mike didn't block him, but he could hear the guard falling in a step behind him, following closely. The diaper aisle was just ahead. Charles could see the familiar packages on the shelves, could almost feel the relief of completing his errand. But something told him this morning's challenge wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The first thing Charles noticed was the price change. The yellow tag on the shelf glared at him. $39.99, up from $32.99 last week. He blinked, checked again. The number didn't change. $7 more, he muttered, doing the mental math. Their monthly budget was already stretched thin with Sarah's medications. This increase meant cutting something else. Mike's shadow fell across the shelf. Talking to yourself, sir? Charles ignored him, reaching for the package. His hand trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the growing anger he refused to show. Those are pretty expensive items, Mike commented loudly. Must be nice to afford the name brand. An elderly white woman pushing her cart past the aisle slowed down, watching. Charles felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The same feeling he'd had in 1965 when a store clerk had followed him through a department store, asking to check his pockets every few minutes. Price check on adult diapers. Mike spoke into his radio, emphasizing each word. Want to verify the gentleman can afford these. The crackle of the radio response was lost under the sound of blood rushing in Charles's ears. He gripped the shelf edge, steadying himself. More phones appeared, their cameras recording. Charles could hear whispers. Is that guard serious? Someone should do something. Poor old man. The sympathy in their voices stung worse than the suspicion. Jenny reappeared at the end of the aisle, now accompanied by another employee, a middle-aged man with a supervisor's badge. Mike, the supervisor called out, what seems to be the problem here? Just doing my job, sir. Making sure everything's in order. Charles pulled his wallet out, checked the contents. The retirement check had cleared yesterday, barely enough to cover the month's expenses. Now with the price increase. Sir, Mike's voice cut through his calculations. I'm going to need to see what's in that bag you're carrying. Charles looked down at the small pharmacy bag from his stop earlier that morning. Sarah's prescription refills. These are my wife's medications, he said, his voice tight. Private medical supplies? Could be anything in there, Mike persisted. Store policy. Store policy, the supervisor interrupted, doesn't include harassing regular customers, Mike. But Mike had already reached for the bag. Charles pulled back instinctively, decades of dignity refusing to let this man paw through his personal belongings. The sudden movement made him stumble slightly. His teacher's pin caught the fluorescent light, flashing briefly. It reminded him of another moment, 30 years ago, when a parent had demanded he be removed from teaching their child's class. "I don't want them learning from someone like him," the parent had said. The principal had stood beside Charles then, saying, "Mr. Wilson is one of our finest teachers. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to enroll your child elsewhere." But there was no one standing beside him now. "Sir," Mike's voice grew harder, "if you resist, I'll have no choice but to." "To what?" Charles finally turned to face him fully. "To call the police? To have me arrested for buying supplies for my sick wife?" "Go ahead." His voice didn't raise, but it carried. Years of commanding classroom attention had taught him how to make words travel. More customers had gathered. Some had stopped pretending to shop, openly watching the confrontation. Charles could see their faces in his peripheral vision, concerned, uncomfortable, uncertain. The supervisor took a step forward. "Mike, that's enough. Mr. Wilson is a potential shoplifter until proven otherwise," Mike cut in. "That's protocol." Charles felt his legs weakening. He hadn't eaten breakfast, too worried about getting to the store early. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. But he couldn't show weakness. Not here. Not now. The memory of Sarah's face this morning flashed through his mind, her eyes full of concern as he left. She'd known something was wrong. She always knew. "Young man," Charles addressed Mike, his voice steady despite his shaking hands. "I've spent 40 years teaching children about dignity, about respect, about judging people by their actions rather than their appearance. What are you teaching anyone right now?" Mike's face flushed darker. "I'm doing my job." "Your job is to protect the store," Charles agreed. "Tell me, what exactly do you think you're protecting it from?" The question hung in the air. In the silence, Charles could hear phones buzzing, whispered conversations, the distant beep of checkout counters. Jenny stepped forward again. "Mr. Wilson, let me help you with your shopping." Mike moved to block her. "Stay back, Jenny. This is a security matter." "This," Charles said quietly, "is a humanity matter." He reached for another package of diapers, adding it to his cart. The price tag seemed to mock him. $39.99 multiplied by 2 now stared back at him. That meant cutting back on groceries this month, maybe delaying the phone bill. But he wouldn't leave without what Sarah needed. He couldn't. The other security guards shifted uncomfortably at their posts. One of them whispered something into his radio. Charles straightened his blazer, touched his teacher's pin for strength. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a constant reminder of where he was, what was happening. "If you'll excuse me," he said, gripping his cart handle tightly. "I need to check out and get home to my wife." Mike's hand moved to block the cart. "I'm not done here." "Yes," Charles replied, looking directly into the guard's eyes. "You are." The supervisor started to say something, but was interrupted by a new voice from the front of the store, calling over the intercom. "Security supervisor to the front desk, immediately." Mike's radio crackled again. Charles couldn't make out the words, but the guard's face showed they weren't what he wanted to hear. The confrontation was building to a head. Charles could feel it, like the pressure before a storm, like the tension in a classroom before a fight broke out. He'd faced moments like this before, but never with Sarah waiting at home, never with her needs hanging in the balance. The decision point was approaching. He could feel it in his bones. Mike planted himself directly in front of Charles's cart, feet spread wide, hands on his belt. The pose might have been intimidating to someone else. To Charles, it looked like a student trying too hard to appear tough. "Empty your pockets," Mike demanded. "All of them. Now." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere in the store, a child started crying. Charles felt the weight of every eye on him, heard the soft clicks of phone cameras. "No," Charles said simply. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Charles's voice remained level. "I will not empty my pockets. I will not show you my bag. I will not be treated like a criminal for buying medical supplies." Mike's face reddened. "Listen, old man, Mr. Wilson," Charles corrected him. "Or sir, if you prefer. I've earned both." A small crowd had gathered now. Charles counted at least 15 people, their phones raised like shields. Jenny stood among them, her hand pressed to her mouth. The supervisor had disappeared, presumably headed to the front desk. "Mr. Wilson," Mike spat the name, "you're making this harder than it needs to be." Charles felt his hands trembling on the shopping cart handle. He thought of Sarah at home, probably watching the clock, wondering why he was late. She'd be needing her medication soon. "Young man," Charles said, "you're right about one thing. This is harder than it needs to be." Mike's radio crackled again. He ignored it. "Last chance," the guard said. "Empty your pockets, or I'm calling the police." Charles reached slowly into his blazer pocket. Mike's hand moved to his radio, but Charles pulled out only his wallet. Old leather, worn smooth by decades of use. He opened it carefully. "Looking for this?" Charles held up his retired teacher ID. The plastic was slightly yellowed with age, but his face was clearly visible. Charles Wilson, Lincoln High School, 40 years of service. Mike barely glanced at it. "That could be fake, and it's not even current." A woman in the crowd spoke up. "That's Mr. Wilson. He taught my daughter history." "Mine too," another voice added. Mike's radio crackled once more. "Brennan, respond immediately. Search him," Mike ordered the other guards, ignoring the radio. Charles felt his legs weakening again. The fluorescent lights seemed to spin overhead. He gripped the card harder, refusing to show weakness. "You will not search me," he said, his teacher's voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "You will not touch me. You will not continue to harass me for buying medical supplies for my wife." "Your wife?" Mike scoffed. "Prove it." Charles's hand moved to his chest pocket, where he always kept a small photo of Sarah. But today, in his rush to leave, he'd forgotten it at home. The moment stretched. Charles felt sweat running down his back under the blazer. His legs trembled. The card handle was the only thing keeping him upright. "I don't have to prove anything to you," he said finally. "My word should be enough." "Your word?" Mike laughed sharply. "Your word means nothing here." The crowd's murmuring grew louder. More phones appeared. Charles saw faces he recognized, parents of former students, neighbors, members of his church. "Mike," Jenny stepped forward again. "That's enough. Mr. Wilson comes here every—" "Stay out of this?" Mike snapped at her. "One more word, and you're fired." Actually, a new voice cut in. "She's not." The store manager appeared at the end of the aisle. Charles recognized him, Mr. Thompson, another former student. Class of '92, if you remember correctly. But before Thompson could reach them, Mike made his move. He grabbed Charles's pharmacy bag. "Let's see what you're really carrying." The sudden motion knocked Charles off balance. His legs, already weak, buckled. The cart slid forward. Time seemed to slow. Charles felt himself falling. Heard gasps from the crowd. Saw Mike's triumphant expression turn to shock. Then strong hands caught him. Jenny and another customer steadied him, helped him regain his footing. "That's assault," someone in the crowd called out. "I'm recording all of this. Somebody call the police." Charles straightened slowly, his dignity wrapping around him like armor. He adjusted his blazer, touched his teacher's pin. "Mr. Brennan," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in the classroom. "You've made several assumptions today. About who I am, about what I'm doing here, about what gives you the right to treat another human being this way." Mike stood frozen, the pharmacy bag still in his hand. "You assumed," Charles continued, "that because I'm black and elderly, I must be stealing. You assumed that because I'm buying expensive items, I must be suspicious. You assumed that your badge gives you the right to strip me of my dignity." The crowd had gone silent. Even the store's usual background noise seemed muted. "But your worst assumption," Charles said, "was thinking I would let you." "Mr. Thompson reached them finally. "Mike, you're suspended pending investigation. Turn in your badge." "You can't," Mike started. "I can and I am." Thompson turned to Charles. "Mr. Wilson, I cannot apologize enough. Please let me." "What I would like," Charles interrupted quietly, "is to purchase these supplies and return home to my wife. She's waiting for me." His legs were still shaking, but his voice was steady. Sarah had taught him that, how to find strength when your body wants to fail you. Mike stood there, badge in one hand, Charles's pharmacy bag in the other. The crowd watched, phones still recording, as the guard's authority crumbled. "The bag, please," Charles said. Slowly, Mike held it out. Charles took it carefully, placed it in his cart alongside the diapers. The confrontation was over, but its weight would linger. Charles checked his watch. 8:45 a.m. Sarah would be needing her medication soon. It was time to check out and go home. The walk to the checkout felt like miles. Charles's legs trembled with each step, the fluorescent lights swimming above him. The crowd parted, creating a path, their phones still raised. Mr. Wilson, Ginny appeared beside him. Let me help you with the cart. He wanted to refuse, to maintain his independence, but the black spots were dancing at the edges of his vision again. He nodded once, letting her take control. Behind them, he could hear Mr. Thompson dealing with Mike, badge, and radio. Now, this is Bullsh. Now, Brennan. The security circle had broken. The other guards stood awkwardly at their posts, avoiding eye contact. Charles kept his head high, though his body wanted to collapse. Register 3 is open, Ginny said softly, steering the cart. The store seemed unnaturally quiet. Even the usual beeping of scanners and rustling of bags felt muted. Charles could hear his own heartbeat, too fast, too loud. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Sir? A young mother stepped forward from the crowd. Are you okay? You look pale. Charles tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. The fluorescent lights blurred overhead. His teacher's pin felt heavy against his chest. Need to sit, he managed to whisper. Jenny reacted quickly, pulling a chair from the nearby customer service desk. Charles sank into it, his legs finally giving out. Someone get him some water. Should we call an ambulance? Give him space. Everyone back up. The voices swirled around him. Charles closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. He thought of Sarah, waiting at home. She'd know something was wrong. She always knew. Here, Mr. Wilson. Jenny pressed a cold water bottle into his hand. Small sips. The water helped. The world slowly stopped spinning. Charles became aware of Mr. Thompson hovering nearby, phone in hand. Mr. Wilson, I called a taxi. Let us get these items rung up. And, no taxi. Charles cut him off. I drove here. I'll drive home. Sir, in your condition, I need to get home to Sarah. His voice was firmer now. She needs her medication. The crowd had thinned slightly, but phones still recorded. Charles could hear whispers. That poor man. Can't believe they treated him like that. Someone should sue the store. The sympathy was almost worse than the suspicion had been. I just need a moment, Charles said, more to himself than anyone else. Just a moment to catch my breath. Jenny stayed beside him, quietly organizing the items from his cart. She handled the packages of diapers with respect, arranging them neatly on the checkout counter. Charles watched her work, his breathing slowly steadying. The trembling in his hands began to subside. A memory surfaced, his first panic attack, 30 years ago, standing before his class. The room had spun just like this, but he'd pushed through it, finished his lesson. His students never knew. The total is $89.47, the cashier announced quietly. Charles reached for his wallet, but his fingers fumbled with the clasp. Take your time, sir, the cashier said. Her name tag read Maria. She looked familiar, probably another former student's child. The store's automatic doors whooshed open and closed in the background. New customers entered, slowing when they saw the crowd, the phones, the suspended guard being escorted to the office. Charles finally managed to extract his debit card. The plastic felt slippery in his sweaty hands. Would you like help with that? Jenny asked gently. No. Charles straightened in the chair. I can manage this part. He inserted the card carefully, punched in his pin. Each number felt like a small victory. The machine beeped, processing. Declined. The word hit like a physical blow. Charles stared at the screen, uncomprehending. That's impossible, he whispered. I just deposited my check yesterday. He tried again. Same result. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. More whispers. More sympathetic looks. Charles felt the room starting to spin again. Without those supplies, without Sarah's medication. I'll cover it, a voice called from the crowd. No, let me, said another. Please, Charles raised his hand, stopping them. I appreciate the offer, but, Mr. Wilson. Jenny stepped closer, lowering her voice. Let us help. Please. He thought of Sarah again. Of her needs. Of her dignity. I have another card, he said finally, reaching for his wallet again. The emergency credit card. the one they'd promised only to use for medical necessities. This qualified. His hands were steadier this time. The transaction went through. Would you like help out to your car? Mr. Thompson asked. Charles shook his head slowly. I need to do this part myself. He stood carefully, one hand on the chair for support. The room stayed mostly steady this time. Jenny began bagging his items, handling each one with care. The crowd started to disperse, though a few phones still recorded. Mr. Wilson, Mr. Thompson started, about what happened. Not now, Charles cut him off. I need to get home to my wife. He took the bags himself, refusing help. Each step was measured, deliberate. His legs still felt weak, but they held him. The automatic doors slid open. Morning sunlight streamed in, harsh after the fluorescent lighting. Behind him, he could hear Mr. Thompson addressing the remaining onlookers. All right, folks, show's over. Let's give Mr. Wilson his privacy. But Charles knew it wasn't over. Not really. The weight of what had happened would follow him out those doors. The parking lot had filled up while Charles was inside. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the sunlight, gripping his bags tightly. His car waited exactly where he'd left it, though the world around it felt completely different. Mr. Wilson. He turned slowly, careful to maintain his balance. Jenny was jogging toward him, something clutched in her hand. Your wallet, she said, slightly out of breath. You left it on the counter. Charles felt his empty pocket. In his hurry to leave, he hadn't even noticed. Thank you, he said, reaching for it. Wait. Jenny's voice dropped lower. There's something else. The cashier. Maria, she needs to speak with you. It's important. Charles checked his watch. 9:10 a.m. Sarah was overdue for her medication. I need to get home, he said. Please. Jenny's eyes were urgent. It'll only take a minute. She said to tell you it's about your card being declined. Charles hesitated. The sun beat down on his shoulders, heavy as judgment. 1 minute, he agreed finally. The walk back felt longer this time. His legs had steadied somewhat, but exhaustion pulled at every step. The automatic doors whooshed open again, cool air conditioning washing over him. Maria stood at her register, serving another customer. But her eyes kept darting to the service desk, where an older woman now sat. The woman looked up as Charles approached. Her hair was gray, styled simply, and her name tag read Margaret, head cashier. Mr. Wilson, she said quietly. I apologize for asking you to come back in, but there's something you need to know. She gestured to a chair. Charles shook his head. I need to stand, he said. My wife is waiting. Margaret nodded. Your card was declined because someone placed a hold on your account this morning. A fraud alert. Charles felt his throat tighten. What? Mike called it in, Jenny whispered, before you arrived. Said he had evidence of suspicious banking activity from known shoplifters. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim. Charles gripped the desk edge. He had no right, he managed. No, he didn't. Margaret's voice was hard. I've already called the bank to explain. The hold should be lifted within the hour. But I thought you should know. Charles straightened his blazer, touched his teacher's pin. 40 years of maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice had taught him how to hide his rage. Thank you for telling me, he said formally. Mr. Wilson, Margaret leaned forward. We're filing a formal complaint. What happened today? It wasn't right? No, Charles agreed. It wasn't. The bank manager said to tell you he's expediting the process, Jenny added. Your account should be unfrozen soon. Charles nodded once. If that's all. One more thing. Margaret pulled out an envelope. Mr. Thompson asked me to give you this. It's a formal apology from the store, and I don't want compensation. Charles cut her off. It's not that. Margaret's eyes were kind. It's a store card for future purchases, so you won't have to worry about incidents like this again. Charles looked at the envelope. Such a small thing to hold so much meaning. Take it, Jenny urged. Please. He reached for it slowly, tucked it into his blazer pocket next to Sarah's empty photo slot. Is that all? He asked. The women exchanged glances. Yes, Margaret said finally. But Mr. Wilson, we're sorry. Truly. Charles straightened to his full height. I'm not the one you need to apologize to. Sir, Apologize to every person who looks like me who walks through those doors. Apologize to every elderly shopper who gets followed around your store. Apologize to every customer who has to prove they belong here. His voice never raised, but it carried. Nearby shoppers slowed, listening. But most of all, he continued, apologize to yourselves for allowing this to happen in the first place. The words hung in the air, heavy as summer thunder. Now, if you'll excuse me, Charles said, my wife needs her medication. He turned, walking away before they could respond. His steps were steadier now, fueled by a different kind of strength. The automatic doors opened one last time. The sunlight welcomed him back. In his pocket, the store card felt like a weight. Not of victory or defeat, but of recognition. Of change, however small. His car waited exactly where he'd left it. The bags of supplies sat ready in the passenger seat. Everything was in order. Charles started the engine, adjusted his mirrors. In the reflection, he could see the store's entrance, where Jenny and Margaret still stood watching. He drove away slowly, deliberately. The way he taught his students to leave a difficult situation with dignity intact. Sarah was waiting, and that in the end was all that mattered. The drive home took exactly 12 minutes. Charles counted each one, turning left at the intersection where the old oak tree stood, right at the community center where he used to teach night classes, straight past the elementary school where Sarah had worked before retirement. His hand still trembled slightly on the steering wheel. As he pulled into his driveway, Mrs. Martinez appeared on her porch next door, watering can in hand. Charles, she called out. Everything okay? You were gone a while. Fine, Clara, he answered, his voice steadier than he felt. Just a busy morning at the store? He gathered the bags carefully, making sure nothing dropped. The pharmacy bag crinkled in his grip, a reminder of what he'd fought for. His house key stuck in the lock for a moment. Charles closed his eyes, took a deep breath. Not now. Not when he was so close. The door finally opened. The TV's familiar mumble greeted him. A morning talk show Sarah liked to watch. I'm home, he called out, his teacher's voice carefully controlled. Sorry I'm late with your medicine, love. Sarah's eyes found him immediately as he entered the bedroom. They widened slightly. She could always read him, even now. Charles set the bags down, moved to her side. Let me get your pills sorted. Her hand twitched toward his, caught his fingers weakly. Her eyes asked the question she couldn't voice. I'm fine, he said, but his voice cracked on the second word. Sarah's grip tightened fractionally. She knew. Of course she knew. Let me get your medication first, Charles said. Then I'll tell you about it. He organized her pills carefully, the routine helping steady his hands. Each capsule in its proper order, water glass ready. Here we go, he murmured, helping her take each one. That's it. Nice and easy. When the last pill was down, Sarah's eyes fixed on him again. Waiting. Charles sank into the chair beside her bed. There was an incident at the store. Her eyebrows drew together in concern. The new security guard, he continued. The word stuck in his throat. Sarah's fingers moved against the blanket, their signal for him to take her hand. He did, feeling her weak but steady grip. He thought I was stealing, Charles said finally. Made a scene, called the bank, put a hold on our account. Tried to search me in front of everyone. Sarah's hand tightened on his. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't wipe away. Don't cry, love. Charles reached for a tissue, gently dabbed her cheeks. I'm okay. See? Still standing. A knock at the door interrupted them. Charles looked up, startled. Through the bedroom window, he could see a familiar news van parked across the street. Stay here, he told Sarah. I'll handle this. The knocking grew louder as he approached the front door. Charles straightened his blazer, touched his pin for luck. When he opened the door, cameras greeted him. Microphones thrust forward like accusing fingers. Mr. Wilson, can you comment on the incident at Supermart this morning? Is it true the security guard assaulted you? Are you planning to sue the store? Charles raised his hand, and the questions died away. 40 years of commanding classroom attention served him well. My wife needs a rest, he said firmly. Please leave our property. But sir, no. His voice carried across the front yard, where more reporters were gathering. What happened this morning was between me and that store. It's not a story. It's not entertainment. It's what happens every day to people who look like me, who are my age, who don't fit someone else's idea of belonging. The cameras kept rolling. Charles stood straighter. If you want a story, he continued, look at why this happened. Look at why a man buying medical supplies for his sick wife becomes suspicious because of his skin color. Look at why dignity has to be earned instead of assumed. A familiar car pulled into his driveway, Mr. Thompson from the store, still in his manager's uniform. Mr. Wilson, Thompson called out, pushing through the reporters. I came to check on you. I'm fine, Charles said. But these people need to leave. Thompson turned to the cameras. The store has no comment at this time. Please respect Mr. Wilson's privacy. Is it true you suspended the security guard? Will there be charges filed? What about the viral video? Viral video? Charles asked quietly. Thompson nodded grimly. Someone posted it online. It's spreading. Charles felt suddenly tired. Behind him, through the open door, he could hear Sarah's TV still playing. James, he said, using Thompson's first name for the first time since he'd been a student, handle this. Please. I need to get back to my wife. Thompson straightened, understanding crossing his face. Yes, sir, Mr. Wilson. Charles turned away from the cameras, back toward his home. Behind him, he heard Thompson addressing the crowd. The store will release a formal statement this afternoon. For now, I must ask everyone to clear the property. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly. The TV murmured. Normal sounds. Home sounds. Charles returned to Sarah's bedroom, where her eyes waited, full of questions. It's nothing, he said, taking his seat beside her. Just some people who think they found a story. Sarah's fingers tapped twice against his hand, her signal for disbelief. You're right, he admitted. It's bigger than that. Someone recorded what happened, posted it online. Her eyebrows raised slightly. I know, Charles sighed. But right now, what matters is getting you comfortable. Let me change these supplies, get you settled. As he worked, he could hear cars still pulling up outside. Voices. Cameras clicking. Remember when I used to tell my students that history happens in small moments? He asked Sarah, carefully adjusting her blanket. In choices people make when no one's watching. Her eyes softened with memory. Well, he continued, seems like everyone's watching now. Sarah's hand found his again, squeezed with what strength she had. I know, love, he whispered. I know. Outside, the world was spinning their story into something bigger than themselves. But here, in this room, with Sarah's hand in his, Charles found his center again. They'd weather this storm like they'd weathered all the others, together. The afternoon light slanted through the bedroom windows, painting golden rectangles on Sarah's blanket. Charles sat beside her, holding her hand, listening to the gradual dispersal of reporters outside. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Former students, colleagues, church members, all calling to check on him, to offer support, to express outrage. He left it ringing. Want to see what all the fuss is about? He asked Sarah softly, reaching for his tablet. Her eyes followed his movements, curious. The video wasn't hard to find. It was everywhere now, under headlines like Elderly Black Teacher Harassed at Supermart and Security Guard Suspended After Racial Profiling Incident. Charles propped the tablet where Sarah could see it. Ready? She blinked twice, yes. The video started shakily, someone's phone camera catching the moment Mike first confronted him in the diaper aisle. Charles watched himself on screen, standing straight-backed in his navy blazer, teacher's pin catching the fluorescent lights. Sarah's fingers tightened on his as the scene unfolded. Look at that old man, Charles commented, trying to keep his voice light. Still standing his ground after all these years. The video captured everything. Mike's aggression, the gathering crowd, Charles's near fall, the final confrontation. But it also caught something Charles hadn't noticed at the time. The faces in the crowd. The way people moved closer. Phones raised not just to record, but to witness. Comments disabled due to sensitivity, the caption read. But the share count kept rising. Thousands. Tens of thousands. Well, Charles sighed, setting the tablet aside. Seems we've gone viral, love. Sarah's thumb stroked his palm weakly, her way of offering comfort. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Charles looked up to see Mrs. Martinez in the doorway. holding a covered casserole dish. "I thought you might need dinner," she said quietly. "The news vans were blocking my driveway all afternoon." "Thank you, Clara." Charles stood slowly, his body reminding him how long this day had been. "But you didn't have to." "Yes, I did." She set the dish down firmly. "And I'm not the only one." She gestured toward the front window. Charles moved to look. The street had finally cleared of reporters, but his front porch was covered in paper bags. Food containers. Flowers. Cards. "The whole neighborhood's been dropping things off," Mrs. Martinez explained. "Once the reporters left, people started coming by. Former students, mostly. Some I recognized from when you were still teaching." Charles stared at the collection of gifts. "I never meant for this to become a movement," Mrs. Martinez finished. "Sometimes we don't choose these moments, Charles. They choose us." Behind them, Sarah made a small sound. Charles returned to her side immediately. "What is it, love? Need something?" She pointed weakly toward his blazer, hanging on the back of the door, specifically at the pocket where he usually kept her photo. Ah, he understood. "I forgot it this morning. That's what started all this, in a way. If I'd had your picture." Sarah shook her head slightly. "Not what she meant." "The envelope?" Charles guessed. "From the store?" She blinked twice. He retrieved it, still unopened. The store's logo was embossed on the heavy paper. "Want me to read it?" Another double blink. Charles settled back in his chair, Sarah's hand finding his again. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was the store card Margaret had mentioned, but also a letter. Charles recognized Thompson's handwriting. "Dear Mr. Wilson," he read aloud. "What happened today was more than a failure of security protocol. It was a failure of humanity." The letter continued, formal but heartfelt. Thompson wrote about being in Charles's history class in 1992, about learning the importance of standing up for what's right, about the impact one person's dignity could have on others. "The store card is not compensation," Charles read. "It's a promise. A promise that what happened today will never happen again to anyone in our store. We are implementing new training protocols, reviewing our security procedures, and making immediate changes to ensure that every customer is treated with the respect they deserve." Sarah squeezed his hand. "The board has asked me to extend an invitation," the letter concluded. "They would like you to help develop our new sensitivity training program. Your experience as an educator, combined with what happened today, makes you uniquely qualified to help us do better." Charles lowered the letter slowly. "What do you think about that, love?" Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her expression was proud. She tapped his hand twice, firmly. "You think I should do it?" 2 more taps. Charles looked at his blazer, at the teacher's pin that had witnessed so much. "Still teaching, after all these years?" Mrs. Martinez cleared her throat softly. "I'll put the casserole in the kitchen. Let you two talk." After she left, Charles sat in the growing evening shadows, holding Sarah's hand. Outside, more cars were pulling up, more former students, more neighbors, more people drawn by the video, but staying because of what it represented. "You know what this means?" he asked Sarah. "If I do this, if I help them, it means telling our story. Over and over. Reliving today, turning it into a lesson." Sarah's fingers moved against his palm, spelling out words like she sometimes did when she needed him to really understand. LOVWINS. Charles felt his own eyes filling. "After 40 years of teaching history, seems I'm not done making it yet." The evening light caught his teacher's pin, making it shine. Sarah's eyes followed the gleam, then met his, full of the same strength he'd fallen in love with 50 years ago. Outside, the world waited with its cameras and comments and viral videos. But here, in this room, with Sarah's hand in his, Charles found his answer. Some lessons needed to be taught, no matter the cost. 3 weeks passed. Charles established a new routine. He shopped during off-peak hours now, early mornings when the store was quiet. He carried Sarah's photo in his wallet, not as proof, but as a reminder of why he kept going. Today was different, though. Today was the first sensitivity training session. "I'll be home by noon," he promised Sarah, adjusting his blazer in the mirror. The teacher's pin caught the morning light. Her eyes followed him as he gathered his materials. The lesson plan he'd spent nights developing, the experiences he'd carefully shaped into teachable moments. "Ginny will stay with you," he continued, checking his watch. She offered to take the morning shift specially. Since that day at the store, Ginny had become a regular visitor, spending her off hours helping with Sarah's care. She claimed it was just to repay Charles for teaching her mother 20 years ago. But they all knew it was more than that. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 a.m. Right on time, Charles nodded approvingly. Ginny stood on the porch, her store uniform replaced with comfortable clothes suitable for caregiver duties. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," she smiled. "Ready for your first day back in the classroom?" "Conference room," he corrected. "But yes, Sarah's had her morning medication. Next dose is at 11, Ginny finished. "I know the routine. We'll be fine." Charles hesitated. In 3 decades of marriage, he'd never left Sarah alone with someone else, not since the stroke. "Go," Ginny said gently. "Make a difference." He entered the bedroom one last time. Sarah was awake, watching him with those knowing eyes. "Sure about this?" he asked. She blinked twice, firmly. Then her fingers moved slightly, spelling against the blanket. "Proud." Charles leaned down, kissed her forehead. "I'll tell you everything when I get back." The drive to Supermart felt different this morning. The store hadn't opened yet. Only staff cars occupied the parking lot. Charles recognized Thompson's vehicle and several others he'd come to know over the past weeks of planning. The automatic doors slid open manually for him, special early access. Inside, the fluorescent lights seemed less harsh somehow. Or maybe he'd just grown stronger under them. "Mr. Wilson." Thompson met him at the customer service desk, hand extended. "Thank you for doing this." Charles shook his hand firmly. Time to turn that viral video into a viral lesson. The conference room was packed. Store managers from every branch in the district, security personnel, corporate representatives, and in the back corner, trying to blend into the wall, Mike Brennan. Charles hadn't expected him to be here. The suspension had ended a week ago, but Mike had requested transfer to another store. Their paths hadn't crossed since that day. "Good morning," Charles began, his teacher's voice filling the room automatically. "I'm Charles Wilson. 3 weeks ago, I was just a man buying supplies for my wife. Today, I'm here to help you understand why that simple act became national news." He looked directly at Mike, saw the younger man's shoulders tense. "But first," Charles continued, "I want to thank the person who started all this. Mr. Brennan." Mike's head snapped up, eyes wide. "Your actions that day were wrong," Charles said clearly. "But they brought us here. They made people pay attention. They created an opportunity for change. And for that, I thank you." The room was silent. Mike's face worked through several emotions before settling on something between shame and understanding. "Now," Charles turned to the wider room, "let's talk about dignity. About assumptions. About the weight of history that follows some of us into every store, every interaction, every moment of our lives." He spoke for 2 hours. About Sarah, about their life together, about 40 years of teaching in a world that didn't always want to learn. He showed the viral video, but also older clips, news reports of similar incidents spanning decades. "This isn't new," he explained. "What's new is that everyone can see it now. Everyone has a camera. Everyone can witness. The question is, what will you do with that witness?" In the back, Mike had stopped trying to disappear into the wall. He sat straight now, watching, listening. "I'm not here to shame anyone," Charles continued. "I'm here to teach. Because that's what I've done for 40 years, and that's what I'll keep doing until these lessons aren't needed anymore." He talked about small moments, about choices made when no one's watching, about the weight of a security guard's stare, a cashier's suspicion, a manager's silence. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Thompson stood up. "We're implementing immediate changes," he announced. "New security protocols, mandatory training, community outreach programs, and Mr. Wilson has agreed to oversee their development." Heads turned toward Charles in surprise. "Part-time," he clarified. "My wife still needs me at home. But yes, I'll help. Because this store is part of my community. And communities only work when everyone belongs." The meeting ended with handshakes, questions, promises of change. Mike lingered until the room emptied, then approached slowly. "Mr. Wilson," he said quietly. I. Save it, Charles interrupted gently. Just do better. That's all any of us can do. The younger man nodded once, then left quickly. Charles gathered his materials slowly, feeling the weight of the morning. His phone buzzed, a text from Jenny. Sarah's good. Asked about you with her eyes at least 10 times. You got a good one, Mr. Wilson. Charles smiled, touching his teacher's pin. Yes, he did. The store would open soon. Regular customers would start arriving, going about their shopping, unaware of the meeting that had just taken place. But things would be different now. Small changes at first, then larger ones. As he walked through the store toward the exit, Charles passed the diaper aisle. The prices were the same. The fluorescent lights still hummed, but something had shifted. Not just in the store, but in him. The automatic doors opened, releasing him into the morning sunlight. His car waited exactly where he'd left it, ready to take him home to Sarah. Some lessons were worth teaching, no matter the cost. Some changes were worth making, no matter how late they came. And some love stories weren't about romance at all, but about standing firm, holding ground, and turning moments of crisis into chances for grace. Charles started his car, adjusted his mirrors, and headed home to tell Sarah everything. After all, the best stories were the ones you shared with someone who already knew how they would end.